Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to come here to speak to you. And on a personal level, it's a relief to be talking about Shakespeare rather than squabbling with pink-haired activists online and trying to explain to people why free speech is actually not a bad idea, which is a message that's not necessarily getting through at the moment. So I'm going to talk about Shakespeare, and particularly at the start, I want to talk about the iconography of Shakespeare. We all have different ideas of what Shakespeare means to us, but we can all picture him, can't we? So we all know the image of the man bald on top, longish hair around the sides and back, with a light moustache and a beard, normally holding a quill, that kind of thing. The best way to see what Shakespeare looked like around the time of his death is to go to Holy Trinity Church at Stratford-upon-Avon. How many people have been to Shakespeare's grave? So a few of you. So it's not the memorial in Westminster Abbey, which was erected in 1740. This is the actual burial place of Shakespeare. If you go into Holy Trinity Church, this very lovely small church in Stratford-upon-Avon, and walk into the chancel, you can see his grave on the floor. There is a curse on the grave, which says, "Good friends, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones," which is quite an interesting final poem for the National Bard to write. All sorts of potential reasons why that might be. Some people speculate it was because he didn't want to be moved to Westminster Abbey. Some people think they didn't want his wife buried in there after he died. So that, well, you know, I don't want to judge. It might be the case that they had a bit of a difficult relationship. We just don't know. But if you go in there and look down at the grave is on the burial stone is on the floor, and then up and to the left, you can see this bust by Gerald Johnson, or maybe his brother. There's some contention over that. A sculpture of Shakespeare in which he looks very much as I've just described, a little plumper than we're accustomed to because he got a bit fatter when he got older. This was a sculpture that Mark Twain described as having the deep, 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 subtle, subtle, subtle expression of a bladder. And not very flattering. John Dover Wilson, the critic, actually said that he had a look of a self-satisfied pork butcher. But that's sort of what he looked like. And that helps the iconography, I think, the fact that we know what Shakespeare looked like. If you look at the first folio, obviously the collection of works from 1623 that was put together by Hemming and Condell, two actors in Shakespeare's company, without which we would have lost a lot of the plays. You know, we wouldn't have Julius Caesar, we wouldn't have Macbeth, we wouldn't have Antony and Cleopatra. It's an incredible feat that they did this. And at the start of the folio, you can see an engraving of Shakespeare, which is by Martin Drusout. And that's probably also what he looked like in his younger years, because that would obviously have been approved by the people who knew Shakespeare best. Hemming Condell, Ben Jonson was involved in that. The engraver probably didn't meet Shakespeare. He was only 22 when he did that. But he would have been working off a likeness of Shakespeare. So we know what Shakespeare looked like, and that has helped his iconic status. But most of all, his iconic status is really fulfilled by the texts themselves, by the body of work that we have that is handed down as a monument that I'm going to argue today is inherently important for our civilization. It is part of the building block of our civilization. And of course, with every icon, someone wants to tear them down, and that always happens. It's always happened throughout history, even. Currently, we're facing a particular ideological drift that sees Shakespeare and all of the major pillars of our civilization as essentially worthless. There was a video put out by Sheffield University that claimed that the only reason we study Shakespeare and people like Shakespeare is because he is fitting into a culture of whiteness. Chaucer was mentioned in this, Virginia Woolf was mentioned in this, and of course, this isn't true. We study Shakespeare because no writer in the English language has bettered him. And I think if you're reading Shakespeare through the lens of contemporary identity politics, you're not really reading Shakespeare at all. But you see, activists see art as just another means by which they can promote their message. So when they see the Transfiguration by Raphael, they don't see a great transcendent work of art. They see pigments on wood, which have been daubed by a powerful white man in the interests of other powerful white men. It's very reductive. It's a little bit sad, isn't it? It's a bit depressing. You wouldn't want to be them. And we found ourselves in this really odd situation where the gatekeepers of the artistic industries, they're actually the ones who are determined to tear this icon down. If you ever go and see modern productions of Shakespeare, I've seen quite a few recently, and they're all generally pretty ghastly, aren't they? I mean, there was a pretty good one in London with Ray Fiennes in Macbeth, And the reason that, well, it was a bit gimmicky. You came in and there was a sort of burnt out car and you were in a war zone, but then there's people holding beakers of Pinot Grigio and taking selfies next to it. So it's not that immersive, to be honest. But then you got in and it was actually fine. There were a few tweaks to the text, as there always are, but it was actually fine because it was Shakespeare's text, played faithfully. And it wasn't the best production in the world, but at least it was the text, and it was interesting. Now, I'm all for people having all sorts of interpretations and doing whatever they like with Shakespeare's plays, but when everyone is doing the same thing, it gets incredibly banal, and everyone is doing the same thing at the moment, right? Everyone is reinterpreting Shakespeare through the lens of group identity, and it's just tedious. Right? I don't mind a bit of that, but if everyone's doing it, then there's no point. This is why I suggest to you that what you do is read Shakespeare. This is the way to go. Maybe it's always been the way to go. I mean, Hazlitt said back in 1820 that Hamlet can only really be read. He felt it couldn't really be performed. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think reading it is the best way to get to it. And like I say, I don't mind reimaginings of the text for a political point. It's always happened. When Laurence Olivier made his Henry V, the film of Henry V during the war, that was a very nationalistic, fervent, patriotic work, which was funded by the British government, and it actually meant something to people. But he had to change it. He had to modify it. So you don't get that moment in Olivier's film where where Henry orders the deaths of the prisoners at Agincourt. You don't get that. Because if you get that, then you get moral ambiguity. You couldn't have that, because for that nationalistic project, Henry V had to be this icon of moral rectitude. So you couldn't introduce those sort of ambiguous elements, which Shakespeare always does. And that really matters, because Shakespeare isn't a moralist. He might have been influenced to a degree by the medieval morality tradition of plays, but he was not writing morality plays. And the problem with today's ideology within the artistic industry is that it demands a morality. What it's sort of saying is that all art must be didactic, and all artists have to convey a certain message. But Shakespeare doesn't fit into that paradigm, because Shakespeare doesn't do that. He sort of stubbornly refuses to reveal his hand. You never know what he thinks about politics. I couldn't tell you what he thinks about anything. What you'll find is that anyone can approach Shakespeare's text and take away from it what they want. It's a bit like the devil can cite scripture to his purpose. It's that idea. You can find anything that you want in Shakespeare, and this is precisely, I think, the source of his brilliance, because he can get inside the heads of all kinds of human beings and all kinds of perspectives. Julius Caesar. Were the conspirators right to assassinate Julius Caesar? It depends on who you're asking. Do you side with Brutus when he gives his speech? Do you side with Mark Antony? It depends on your perspective of populism, I should imagine. And so, but both sides are seen. He can see through other people's eyes. Macbeth. What's the moral of Macbeth? Is there a moral of Macbeth? Don't go around killing kings? Maybe. Beware of ambition. You can reduce it to anything. Is Macbeth destined to act as he does? Would he have done this anyway because of his essential flaw? Not a morality play. I think what's very interesting about Macbeth is that he is a murderer. He does do these terrible things, but we're inside his head. We're along for the journey. We have that nagging, awful sensation while we're watching it that we could have done the same thing. And that's a terrible, unsettling, and fascinating experience. So yes, these plays explore the most powerful emotions, the most terrible deeds of which humankind is capable, the struggles for power, the bloody revenge, the pitfalls of love and hate. And Shakespeare is able to explore why human beings behave as they do. And it's really rare for a writer to be able to do this, to be able to inhabit so many different perspectives. Very few writers can do this. If you think of a contemporary... I really love the films of Quentin Tarantino. I don't know if you're fans. But you have to be honest and say that pretty much every character in a Quentin Tarantino film sounds like Quentin Tarantino. Even that 9-year-old girl in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood talks like Quentin Tarantino, doesn't she? And that's sort of fine. I really enjoy that. I think that's incredible. But not the case in Shakespeare. You can cover when you're into the Shakespearean text, if you cover the names up, you'll know who's speaking because of their thought process. Of course, if you're not accustomed to reading Shakespeare, it looks like it's heightened iambic pentameter, Elizabethan poetry, and so obviously there's a sense of similarity, stylistic sense, but they are characters that think individually, all of them. He's interested in human nature. Kings and queens aren't abstract figures in these plays. They are men and women with flaws like the rest of us, subject to the same desires subject to the same anxieties. Just read Richard II, you'll get that straight away. He's interested in human nature. Human nature doesn't change, and this is why he lasts. And I think he's better at this than anyone. I think he encapsulates our struggles with the human condition more effectively through his language than anyone else. I'll give you an example. I don't think there's any better encapsulation of the notion of despair, and I mean that in the literal meaning of the word of despair, godlessness, a sense of the futility of existence. That's never been better captured, I don't think, than in Macbeth, than in that moment when, you know the scene when Lady Macbeth has killed herself. And this is told to Macbeth, and this is, he doesn't mourn, he doesn't cry out, he is numb. He is seized with despair in the old sense, total futility. What does he say? He says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that fruts and struts his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It's astonishing. And, well, don't applaud me, that's Shakespeare. But Macbeth's mind is full of scorpions, as he says it. And he wants to share that with us. He wants to bring us in. We become immersed. It's unsettling. It's fascinating. Hasn't been bettered. Now, as I said, icons are always subject to iconoclasm, always. Even Tolstoy had a pop, didn't he? Tolstoy tried to bring Shakespeare down in a famous essay. Didn't work, did it? It's weird, isn't it? Because someone as intelligent as Tolstoy, an absolute genius, doesn't understand that Shakespeare shouldn't be read as though he's writing realistic novels. That Shakespeare's in fact producing poetry. I mean, one of Tolstoy's big problems was in King Lear. He didn't like the fact, he didn't believe that Gloucester would believe that one of his sons had written and conspired against him in a letter and sent the letter to his other son, even though they live in the same house. Well, it obviously wouldn't happen. But it doesn't matter, because we're dealing with poetry here. Shakespeare isn't interested in realism. He's interested in getting at something else. You may as well complain about the seaport in Bohemia in Winter's Tale. It's a landlocked country, you know. If you look at the opening of Two Gentlemen Verona, you know, there's a port in Milan. No, there isn't. You know, Twelfth Night, you have identical twins, but they're different biological sex. Can't be done. Comedy of Errors, you've got two sets of twins. And it only takes place in one day, that play. And we're expected to believe that, you know, the two Antipholuses and the two Dromios, on that day, never seen each other, but they happen to be wearing the same clothes. So everyone confuses them. None of this matters. None of it matters. Because Shakespeare is not attempting to recreate life as it is. He's trying to help us immerse ourselves in scenarios that are essentially poetic approximations to the truth of human existence. You know, I mean, we don't speak in blank verse, do we? We have to kind of, well, we don't, most of us. You know, what like Paulina says in The Winter's Tale, it's a neat way to encapsulate what I think you do when you go to the theatre. She says, and she's talking about just before the reanimation of Hermione's statue, she says, it is required you do awake your faith. That, I think, sums that up. That's what you do when you go to the theatre. That's what you do when you read a poem, when you engage with a great work of art. So, and I've been thinking a lot recently about the purpose of art, and I've always been a big believer in art for art's sake. You know, I don't think that if an artwork is produced and not necessarily widely disseminated, it is of less value. I think of all the masterpieces that must be languishing under the volcanic ash at Herculaneum, you know, because the Italian government won't get its act together and excavate. And it better be quick because Vesuvius is due another explosion, right? All of that doesn't matter. The art still is valuable in of itself. There are lost plays by Shakespeare. You know, Cardenio, Love's Labour's Won, which sounds like a joke, but it was a real play. All sorts of lost... Aeschylus, you know, there were almost 100 plays by Aeschylus, and what have we got, 7? So art for art's sake is really, really important, and I've been a big believer in that. But I've recently been challenged on that, and I want to share this challenge with you, and I've had my mind changed ever so slightly. So I was reading, I don't know if any of you have read Victor Hugo's book on Shakespeare. Has anyone read that? No one. No, it's unusual. It's not canonical. Firstly, it's not about Shakespeare. I mean, it's called Shakespeare. It's not about Shakespeare. There's like about 5% is about Shakespeare. It's really a meditation on the notion of artistic genius. And he talks about this idea of art for art's sake. And what he says about that is, well, this is the quotation. He says, art for art's sake may be very fine, but art for progress is finer still. So what does he mean by this? What is Victor Hugo talking about here? Well, he's arguing for the notion of art as a fundamental constituent of civilization. This is what he says. He says, genius is not made for genius, it is made for man. Genius on earth is God giving himself. Every time that a masterpiece appears, it is a distribution of God that takes place. The masterpiece is a variety of the miracle. I think this applies whether you believe in God or not, because we all understand the sensation of the numinous when we engage with serious works of art. So he's arguing not for art's sake, but art for progress, right? He's suggesting, and he actually is very specific about this. Hugo thinks that in every generation, he estimates about 3 or 4 geniuses emerge. 3 or 4 artistic geniuses. That sounds about right to me. I think that is about right. So we need to make a distinction here. There are lots and lots of great artists and artistic geniuses, but they don't reach the pinnacle of these masters. You know, Michelangelo, Aeschylus, Shakespeare, Dante, okay, Mozart. These come along very, very, very rarely, okay? I'm not denigrating other artists or other creators. My favourite novelists are all from the 20th century. Stella Benson, E.M. Forster, Norman Douglas, Kazuo Ishiguro. These are brilliant, brilliant artists, but they're not this kind of genius that Hugo is talking about. We need a new word for it, really, because the word genius is very degraded. Have you noticed? You know, even they'll review an album by Harry Styles and say it's a work of genius. So we really need a new word for this. But Hugo's very clear about what he's talking about. And he actually makes this point that, you know, we think of historical civilization in terms of kings normally. It's quite a handy way to divide it up. You know, but is it really the best way to divide it up? You know, is it more sensible to think in terms of the Elizabethan age that comes to an end with the death of Elizabeth in 1603 and then we're into the Jacobean age? Is that the best way to think about it? Or might we think about it in terms of the Shakespearean age, which of course straddles both of those? And I think that's more interesting. And I think the artist is the most important person in society, in our civilization. I think that I would prefer that to be the way that we measure epochs, but it isn't what we do. Now, one of the things that Victor Hugo does not address in this book, which is what I want to talk about here a bit, is that I don't think it ever crossed his mind, because he lived in an age when art and the value of art was taken for granted. But what if, I mean, he's talking about these geniuses that emerge every now and then. What if the societal conditions are such that genius cannot be cultivated, that artistic genius cannot emerge? I mean, think about it. If Mozart's father hadn't decided to take him on tour of Europe, hadn't decided to take him to play before the Bavarian court, what if he'd have said, just step away from the harpsichord, Wolfgang, and do something a bit more manly? Okay? Now, you have Mozart's genius, which is innate, comes from nowhere. Like Hugo says, must be a gift from something. But it's not cultivated. The circumstances are not apt for him to emerge. This is why I think the 3 to 4 number might be wrong. Maybe there are lots and lots of these kinds of uber geniuses in every generation, but they just don't have the good fortune to be born in the right circumstances for that to work out. And I think we're living through that kind of moment at the moment, insofar as I would challenge any of you to name any great masterpiece that has been produced within the woke era. Can't be done. And it never will be. It won't happen. The conditions are simply not right. So I don't believe that these incredible uber geniuses aren't around. They are amongst us, but they cannot emerge. It won't be possible. So, as I say, and I'm really not degrading artists who don't reach those pinnacles, because that's basically everyone. They are really important. They make life worth living. They generate our culture. They generate our civilization. And they also do something else in terms of Hugo's argument of art for progress. What they also do is help contribute towards those very conditions where the great geniuses can emerge. You know, without Christopher Marlowe, a lesser writer, you wouldn't have William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is often responding to Marlowe or trying to beat Marlowe. There's a lot of that going on in his plays. You know, without Donatello, you don't get Michelangelo. We need artists of varying degrees of quality to create those conditions where a Shakespeare can emerge. I'm not saying either that artists don't have to work around the system. They always do. Shakespeare did. You know, if you read his two great narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, you'll remember they are preceded by a really fawning dedication to Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton. And it's a bit embarrassing to read. I mean, this is from The Rape of Lucrece. He says, "The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end, whereof this pamphlet, without beginning, is but a superfluous moiety." Come on. Right? So he knows he's written something great, but he's pretending he hasn't. He says in Venus and Adonis, "I know not how I shall offend in dedicating my unpolished lines to your lordship, nor how the world will censure me for choosing so strong a prop to support so weak a burden." It's hilarious. But, you know, Henry Wriothesley was easily flattered, by all accounts, and gave him lots of money. They needed patrons at the time. One of my big worries at the moment is we don't really have those patrons now. We have an arts council that is completely ideologically captured. All of the major theatres are completely ideologically captured. So we don't have those patrons, you know. I'm always on about the billionaires of the world. The thing that they need to do, if they really want to win the culture war, if they really want to bring us round, they need to fund the arts properly. But that's not happening. Because it's very difficult to explain to entrepreneurs and right-wing people how important art is. It's nearly impossible. It's true. It's really hard. Because they think it's just frivolous and it's not making money. But some of the best work doesn't. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So they find ways around it. Artists do find ways around various regimes. You remember but there was always that sense that they could get away with stuff. I mean, most of the great art of history is, of course, religious in nature because the patrons were religious and those were the demands. Those were the constraints within which the artist had to work. The Sistine Chapel is wonderful. It's also quite erotic, isn't it? Because, you know, suddenly Michelangelo can paint naked men, and he's allowed, you know, and he can be cheeky with it. There was the guy who was the papal master of ceremonies who complained about the nudity, and so he turned him into the judge of the underworld, Minos. If you look at the Last Judgment, bottom right, he's there. That's his face. That's this guy who complained with the donkey's ears and the snake biting his cock. That's how Michelangelo reacted to it. So, but you could do that then. So the Vatican, the church understood that artists are eccentric and difficult and weird, and you know you have to give them some freedom. The best patrons are the ones who hand over the money and say, "Do what you want. I trust you as an artist." Not create a work of art that promotes my worldview, because that's very boring. Now, sometimes artists do this innately. I mean, if you look at Macbeth, well, he's obviously trying to flatter James I in that, isn't he? James I was obsessed with witches. And so he introduces witches to the story, okay? It's about a Scottish king. It's about a king who is deposed. James I was terrified, with good reason. I mean, the gunpowder plot had just happened, right? So it's playing to his enthusiasms, but it's not artistically compromised, is my point. Shakespeare's found a way to do it. He also changes it, by the way, so that Banquo is the good guy. So if you look at the original chronicles, Banquo is not. Banquo is a co-conspirator. But James I liked to think that he was descended from Banquo, so that wasn't going to work. So Shakespeare makes Banquo the good guy, okay? And I know this sounds a lot like I'm complaining about, oh, things aren't as good as they used to be, which all old people do. But I actually think things haven't been good in my lifetime. You know, I think you need to go way back. We're not at the pinnacle of artistic heights, are we? Let's just be absolutely honest about this. Well, if you think about what happened when, you know, Benvenuto Cellini. By the way, if you read Cellini's autobiography, it's an incredible book. He is responsible for my favourite sculpture, which is the Perseus in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. And you can go and see it. It's just out on the street, which is one of the reasons I think Florentine culture is better than ours, insofar as you get less muggings and things, because there's great art on the street. It's true. You can go walking for ice cream at midnight in Florence. You're not going to get punched in the face. Can't do that in Ipswich. Now, when you look at this statue, Perseus, in the Piazza della Signoria, opposite the replica of David, as a response to it, it's a political statement. And it's so brilliant. And when it was unveiled, the accounts are very clear about this. When it was unveiled, everyone gathered to see this unveiling, rich and poor alike. When it was unveiled, they judged it, they cheered. For days afterwards, people pinned sonnets of appreciation to the pedestal of the Perseus. Right? Now, that doesn't happen at the fourth plinth. When they unveiled the whipped cream with the fly on it, There were no sonnets of appreciation being pinned to that. Firstly, because it's terrible, it's bad art, but also because even if it were good art, we don't have that kind of civilization now. And I think we do, at the risk of sounding terribly conservative, I think we do have to try and get that back, don't we? I think it's been lost. And I think the attacks on Shakespeare are an example of people trying to ensure that we don't succeed in that endeavour. Okay? So, having now established that all modern art is terrible and that civilization is basically over, I want to move on to this question of Shakespeare. How did Shakespeare manage to emerge in the first place? That's a really interesting question. Where did he come from? If we are to go along the Victor Hugo line and to say that civilization is based on art, is fundamentally grounded in art, and if we go along with the idea that the genius can only emerge given the correct cultural circumstances, how is it then that Shakespeare, a middle-class boy from the Midlands, a Brummie, how could he become the greatest writer in the English language? How did that happen? Okay? And there's a lot of, I thought it might be quite interesting just to think about. In other words, what did the 16th century get right that we're getting wrong? You know? So he comes from Stratford-upon-Avon. I think there's all sorts of reasons why this actually occurred. He's the son of a glover, not that prosperous. He's rich enough, though. I mean, his father was an alderman and then a bailiff, which is basically the mayor of Stratford-upon-Avon. Then he fell into a lot of debt, which is why he didn't go to church, didn't want to get caught. So he comes from this sort of reasonably comfortable but not rich family in a very rural area. His mother, Mary Arden, has an aristocratic background, we think. Comes from the Forest of Arden back there. But you know, so reasonably comfortable but not rich. So what happened there? Well, the key thing, I think, firstly, is education. So Shakespeare went to grammar school. And you can go to the grammar school. If you go to Stratford-upon-Avon, I would urge you to go and see it. It's actually a working school. And you can stand in the room where Shakespeare was educated. I went to a conference there once. It's really interesting. The reason why that matters is because the grammar school education of the time gave him all of the necessary grounding that he required to become the playwright that he did. A lot of the conspiracy theorists who say Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, these mad people, one of the things they say is always someone who didn't go to university couldn't have written these books. Someone who wasn't aristocratic couldn't have written about lords, ladies, and princes and queens, which is an incredible kind of snobbery, really. And it's just not true. I mean, Shakespeare didn't go to university partly because of his father's debt, probably, but also he was married at that point. He got married when he was 18 to Anne Hathaway, who was 26, because she was pregnant. It was all very rushed, very controversial, and he couldn't go to university at that point. He didn't need to. Thank God he didn't. Didn't need to. Would have ruined him. Right? Because the great thing about Shakespeare is he's not like the Christopher Marlowes or the John Lillys of the world. He's not over-intellectualized. Would have ruined it. So the grammar school education was necessary. That gave him the grounding, gave him everything that he needed. He knew Cicero. He knew Homer. He knew Plautus. He knew all the texts that he needed to know. They're all in there in the plays, very, very clearly as well. Ovid recurs again and again. And then what happened? So he's educated at grammar school. At some point, he goes down to London. I'm going to date this around 1587. Can't be sure about that, but I think that's a pretty reasonable bet. Very interestingly, there was an American scholar called Mark Eccles, no longer with us, who wrote a book about Shakespeare's time in Warwickshire, dug through all of the archives in a way that no one had done before. He found that there was a touring theatre group in 1587 that went to Stratford-upon-Avon that was a man short because one of their company was murdered in Oxford. Or in Oxfordshire. Well, it was rough times, you know. And so they turn up, and it's possible, it's an interesting theory, isn't it, that Shakespeare joins that troupe and goes back to London around 1587. However it happened, whether it was through contacts or whatever, he ended up in London, working in the theatre in some capacity. We don't know quite what. We do know, some people say that he was the guy who held the horses outside as people went in. We just don't know what happened. Oh, by the way, when people say that we have no knowledge of Shakespeare's biography, not true. For a commoner, for someone of his standing, we have an awful lot of documentary evidence about Shakespeare, considering. So he goes all the way to London from home. He leaves his wife and his kids, which is why we might suggest that they don't have a great relationship. I know people say, well, if you think about it, he left Anne Hathaway the second best bed in his will. And a lot of people say, yeah, but it was a really nice bed. You know, it was more Harrods than DFS. But actually, it's still a bit of a snub, isn't it? So I think we know that there was some kind of, he spent most of his life in London. And he goes away, it's about 83 miles to London. It's a bit of a culture shock. He goes from a place, Stratford-upon-Avon, there's only about 2,500 people. He's suddenly in London where there's 200,000 people. It's packed, it's rammed, there's an exuberant, exciting theatrical scene going on. But the timing, I think, is key. I think we got lucky. 1587, if we're going to say 1587, because the public theatres have only just been established for a couple of decades. They haven't been around very long. This is now flourishing. This is a new art form. Okay? We've got theatrical companies. There's two big theatrical companies. There's the Admiral's Men, there's the Lord Chamberlain's Men. So the city's population, for the first time, are going to these public theatres as a means of entertainment. And there's a lot of doggerel, and there's a lot of rot that was written in those early days of the public theatres. But something new is happening around the 1580s, late 1580s. We have the introduction of the university wits. I'm sure you've heard of the university wits. We have people who have graduated from Oxford and Cambridge, intellectuals who are writing for the stage. And remember, the stage is not considered high art at this point. The high art was written in Latin and Greek. This was not, it was poetry. It's people like Thomas Watson. This isn't high art. This is the theatre. It's quite low art. But now you've got people like John Lilly, George Peele, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, Robert Greene. These are the university wits. Thomas Kidd, who didn't go to university, but they call him one of the wits. And these people who are creating really informed literary works with allusions to the classics, and it's going on. They're developing this craft, and Christopher Marlowe is the major pioneer of blank verse, iambic blank verse, and we have a heightened form of art. It's not just popular culture anymore. It's that incredible nexus of popular culture and high art occurring just when Shakespeare arrives in London, just at that moment, which I think is really important. He's also entering into this dizzying whirlpool of cultural and historical forces. We're 1 year away from the Spanish Armada. There is the capital is gripped with this fervour, this patriotic fervour, because of the imperial war with Spain. And that's why so many of Shakespeare's early plays are the histories. He goes right through from King John, eventually to Henry VIII, which is a late play, obviously, but he goes through the whole spectrum. And he can do that at this time, you know? And also at this time, same time, 1587, you're in a moment where the writers are preoccupied with this foundation of a national literature. They want English literature to be up there with the classics, okay? But at this point, Chaucer's language is already obsolete, and people are saying it's the Greek, it's the Latin, and people are making the case for English poetry. There's a book by George Putnam called The Art of English Poesy. He's making the case for English. And you've got people like Philip Sidney, his Arcadia, Spenser's Fairy Queen. We're starting to develop a sense of significance, cultural significance in English. And like I say, the stage is not that. And Shakespeare's there. So, I don't think the conditions could have been better for an aspiring writer. But Shakespeare has to compete, doesn't he? He has to compete with these very lettered peers. And he can't just produce hack work. And he can't just produce the kind of run-of-the-mill pot boilers that were being put on at the Inns of Court. There's this concatenation of circumstances that occur just as he gets there. It's a unique moment. And the other thing is, of course, we are used to the theatre being an elitist pastime. You go to the theatre and everyone's quite well off, or most people are quite well off. There are some cheap tickets at the back, but it's generally an upper middle class or middle class pursuit. This is a unique time where you have a cross-section of society. You have the very poorest, the groundlings, the people paying a penny to stand in that middle area. You've got the people paying, the rich people paying to sit in the gallery, or sometimes paying an extra sixpence and sitting on the stage on cushions because they want to show off their clothes. And you have all this going on, and that has never been replicated. We've never had that in the theatre in the UK. We've never had that cross-section of society, this kaleidoscope of rich and poor, this combination of popular culture and high art. It's just not something we've had. The other thing is that the design of these public theatres is incredible and is actually, I think, really key to the formulation of Shakespeare's art. Because you can do, there's a big stage. If you've been to the Globe, you can see it's pretty much an exact replica of the Globe. It's about 400 metres away from where it was, but it's pretty much exact. And you can see the size of that stage. You can have epic battle scenes. Remember, at this time, people were actually fighting with swords. It could be impressive. It could be epic. At the same time, it could be intimate. You can have someone standing in that stage. No one is any more than 40 feet away. No one. You can sit right at the back of the gallery. And so you can have these soliloquies. Shakespeare develops the soliloquy in a way that no other writer had ever done. And for the first time, people are standing on stage, expressing what is going on in their minds, even interrogating what is going on in their minds. If you look at some of Macbeth's or Hamlet's soliloquies, we start to know more about them than they do. They are working stuff out as they speak. It is an incredible innovation in terms of literature. Hadn't been done before, hasn't been done as well since. That's a key question. Why is it that if Shakespeare can emerge at the early days of the public theatre, the early days of this medium, why has he never been bettered? I mean, if we believe in this teleological view of society and progress, surely a better playwright should have come along at some point later. Didn't happen, did it? Okay? So we've got the timing, the patriotic fervour of the town, the university wits, the development of a new medium. All of this happens at around the same time. The actual design of the physical design of the theatres. And then, of course, you have as well some good luck in there, most definitely. Now, we know that Shakespeare started to become successful. The earliest reference to him is quite a bitter, jealous one. I'm sure you probably know this. This is the Robert Greene's paper. Robert Greene he's one of the university wits, and he wrote this pamphlet. And he had a go at Shakespeare. He was really annoyed about him. And this is what he said. I've got it written down here. By the way, he wrote this on his deathbed. He may not have written it at all. This was a common thing they used to do back then. You know, if you wanted to slag someone off, you choose someone who's dead, and you publish it under their name, and then you get away with it. And so that might have happened. I remember my old supervisor, Catherine Duncan-Jones, she used to think it was Thomas Nash who wrote this. It does sound like Nash. Anyway, so this is the comment from Greene. He says, "There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, jack of all trades, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country." It's not subtle. He's having a go at Shakespeare. He's calling him an upstart crow. What does he mean by beautified with our feathers? Well, because Shakespeare was an actor, not a playwright. He starts as an actor. And there is a player, he says, and he describes him as a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. That's a parody of a line from Henry VI, Part 2. "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide." Part 3, sorry. He's having a dig at the actual line of Shakespeare, calling him an upstart crow, saying he's stealing from us. He's beautifying himself with our feathers. He's taking our great... And he's just an actor. He's just a nothing. He didn't go to university. Johannes factotum. He was. He was a producer. He was an actor. He was a writer. He was doing everything. And he was doing it better than them. And I think this was a source of great discomfort for them. But, of course, a lot of them died, didn't they? Marlowe got stabbed in the face. What, 1593? Around then? Robert Greene's dead, 1592. Thomas Watson's dead. The greatest Latin poet of the age. They all sort of die at around the same time. And Shakespeare gets to benefit from that. You know, it's undoubtedly, I mean, you know, Tamburlaine was huge. Marlowe was absolutely huge. Tamburlaine was only 23 when he did Tamburlaine. It was a massive hit. So massive, he did a sequel, Tamburlaine Part 2. And what I love about that is the prologue at the start says, basically, we've written a sequel to capitalise on the first. I mean, he comes out and says it, which is fair enough, you know. So there's actually a really interesting moment in Hamlet, which I think is having a go at Robert Greene. Because you know that phrase, he says, "An upstart crow beautified with our feathers." It's a very specific kind of phrase. And in Hamlet, you've got this moment where Polonius is reading aloud the letter from Hamlet to Ophelia. And he says, "To the celestial and my soul's idol, the most beautified Ophelia." And he stops himself. And Polonius says, "That's an ill phrase, a vile phrase. Beautified is a vile phrase." I think we know what's going on there. He's having a go at Greene. And of course, you know, and then he took one of Greene's most popular novels, Pandosto, and turned it into The Winter's Tale towards the end of his life. So anyway, look, I'm running a bit over, so I will wrap this up now. But what I want to emphasise is that what Greene's words tell us at that point is that Shakespeare wasn't an overnight success. It took him all these years. And of course that, at the moment of Greene's death, he's hit with the plague years as well, 1592, 1593. Theatres shut down. But Shakespeare finds an advantage and writes his narrative poems, Venus and Adonis. He writes Rape of Lucrece. He probably writes most of the sonnets at that point. He is the ultimate poet. He is one of those uber geniuses that Victor Hugo was talking about. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to get at, really. For genius to flourish, for Victor Hugo's conception of genius to flourish, for those pinnacles of human artistic achievement, you need these combination of things. I've pinpointed this at 1587, which is also by the year that Holinshed's Chronicles is published, the second edition that Shakespeare used, which he stole a lot of the plots from. Shakespeare was a complete magpie, by the way, took his plots from absolutely everywhere and made them better. No wonder he annoyed people, you know, because plot, he wasn't interested in plot. He wasn't interested at all. The plot is just there to hang on the dramatic exploration of the human experience. It doesn't matter to him. So if it is the case that we only have 3 or 4 per generation, Shakespeare was one of these, you need all sorts of things. You need the historical circumstances to be right. You need good timing. You need luck, right? You need a population that values art. And most important of all, you need a ruling class that supports art as well. People often forget that Queen Elizabeth I was a big supporter of the theatre, major patron of the theatre. Without her, Shakespeare doesn't happen, just doesn't happen. We need all of those things in a row for these geniuses to emerge. When those conditions are met, then the Shakespeares of the world can emerge and civilization can be sustained. And that's why I think in these endless, tedious culture wars, I think it's worth reminding ourselves what it is we're fighting for. The best way we can do that is to read our Shakespeare. Thank you.